144. Worship the King of glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the ancient of days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise. Thy bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light. It streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills the dew and the rain. Till children of dust and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend. Number two. Praise be the Son for Jesus to died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. We praise thee, O God, for thy Spirit of light, who has shown us our Savior and scattered our night. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. All glory and praise to the Lamb that was slain, who has borne all our sins and has cleansed every stain. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. All glory and praise to the God of all grace, who has bought us and sought us and guided our ways. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Revive us again. Fill each heart with thy love. May soul be rekindled when far from above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again.
Father in heaven, be with us as we study your word tonight. Help us to be able to block out the cares and distractions of this world, to be able to focus on the book of Mark, and to be able to delve into the last couple chapters of Mark. Be it David as he teaches the class tonight. Help him to be able to communicate the words that you want him to communicate to us. Help us all to be able to receive those words. Be with all those that are sick and traveling, especially with Matt as he'll be traveling home from Alaska. Give him a safe trip home this coming weekend. Be with those that are still feeling sick. Be with our sister Jeannie. Help her to completely recover if that's your will. Be with Bart Brown as he's struggling with his cancer, and be with Maria as she's up in Salt Lake. Help her enjoy her time there and give her a safe trip home. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right. Good to see everyone here tonight. And Dean and Sandy, good to have you guys home. And there are several still traveling, my wife included. She's up in Salt Lake on a work conference tonight. And Mary, good to have you here as well. It's good to have everybody here, not just select people, everybody. I'm glad not to be here by myself tonight. But let's get into Mark, chapter 14. That's where we're going to be spending our time. And Don, I also wish you a welcome home as well, because you were traveling as well.
Get back home.
Yeah.
Good part traveling. I got gone around 10 days.
It was about that. Well, Mark 14, here in this chapter, we are continuing to, quote-unquote, move toward the cross, because what Mark is recording in this chapter, as he has been since chapter 13, is record some of the teachings of Jesus and the events in the city of Jerusalem that would culminate themselves in the crucifixion, shortly followed by the burial and resurrection. So as we come to this chapter, we learn in verses 1 and 2 that as the festivals of the Passover and the unleavened bread were approaching, the religious leaders, they were secretly determining how they might arrest and kill Jesus in such a way that they might not cause a riot among the Jewish people during the festivals of the Passover and unleavened bread. Then we come to verses 3 through 9. We read about Jesus being at a meal. A woman comes in and pours her expensive perfume over Jesus' head. We studied that many were angry with her for doing this because it was an expensive perfume that could have been sold and the money given to the poor, but Jesus said that that event functioned as an anointing for his burial and that this woman should be left alone. So it's those things, it's in that context that as we come to verses 10 and 11 of this chapter, Mark records for his readers what has been called one of the most restrained accounts of Judas's initial efforts to betray Jesus, due to the fact that Mark's account of Judas's initial efforts to betray Jesus consists of only 2 verses. Again, this is just the initial efforts, but this record consists of only 2 verses. It has the least amount of detail, whereas the other accounts of this initial part of the betrayal story that we have in Matthew, Luke, and John, we find more details than Mark records for us in these 2 verses about Judas betraying Jesus. But even though this is the case, even though this is the case that Mark does not provide his readers with as many details as the other gospel writers do, there is much that can be learned. Sorry, I'm a little congested tonight. Excuse me. There is much that can be learned from these 2 verses about how Judas initially went about betraying Jesus. Shortly after this occasion, when the woman of verses 3 through 9 used her perfume to anoint Jesus for his burial, even though she did not fully realize that's what she was doing. So, since we do have a very short section to deal with, and Mark does not record for us the details that some of the other gospel writers do. We are going to touch on some of the other gospels to help, quote unquote, fill in the holes that Mark leaves in these two verses. So what we're going to do tonight as we spend time with these verses is explore 2 points that Mark does make in verses 10 and 11 about Judas's betrayal. Point number 1 from verse 10 is that Judas went off to betray Jesus. Second point we'll explore in verse 11 is that Judas looked for a convenient time to betray Jesus. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that even today, it is still possible to betray Jesus, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Well, let's read verses 10 and 11, and then we'll look at the points. Again, we're in Mark 14, beginning in verse 10, we read. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. They were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money, and he began seeking how to betray him at an opportune time. So again, 2 verses, 2 points about Judas's betrayal. First, he went off to betray Jesus, verse 10. Now, how is Judas identified here at the beginning of this verse? As one of the 12. One of the 12 what? Apostles. He was among those chosen 12. And so this is how Mark identifies him, as one of the 12. Now, with that in mind, I think something we should understand from this part of the verse is that the phrase one of the 12 could be more literally translated as the one of the 12, because in the original language that article is there. It's rendered as the one of the 12. Now, you might be asking, well, who cares, David? Why is that important? That's important because by calling Judas, we don't see it in the English again, but by referring to Judas as the one of the 12, if we translate it literally, Mark seems to be distancing Judas from the other 11 apostles. He's singling him out. In other words, Jeremiah, your hand is up.
He's the only non-Galilean also, as all the others are from Galilee in that area. He is directly south of Jerusalem. Iscariot means man of, I was trying to look it up, it's man of which is a town south in Judea, or in Judah. So it's totally different, and he is separate from the 11 anyway.
Okay, I failed to come across that information, but yes, that's another respect in which Judas would be separate from the other 11 because he's not originally from Galilee. But here that is in the context of his betrayal, but he's also distanced from the 12 in that he's the only one who betrayed Jesus in the way that we're looking at now. Now, I think with all that in mind, something else we should understand here is that in the list of the apostles we have in the Gospels, Judas is always at the end. Can anyone tell me why? If you can't, I will tell you. Anyone tell me why Judas is always at the end of the list? What's that, Dean? That's not, I mean, that one might be one idea that crosses our mind, but that's not necessarily the case. It's a good answer, though. Anyone else want to chime in?
Early century churches didn't believe he was Pentecostal, so in turn, because he did not live after Christ's death, so he in turn did not have the Holy Spirit come upon him to make him an actual apostle at that point.
Okay, that might be one thing we can consider as well. But another thing that I'd like to submit to you for your consideration is that when we have lists of names in the Bible, most often the person at the end of that list is the least important. Now, by way of contrast, when you look at the list of the apostles, Peter is first, and that tells us that he's considered to be the most important. Now, that's not always true, but it's sometimes true. And it is true of the list of the apostles. Judas is at the end because he's considered the least important, One reason for that is because he is the one who betrayed Jesus. And when you look at the list of the apostles, that's how Judas is identified, as the traitor, the one who betrayed Jesus. That fact is tacked onto his name. Questions or comments on Judas before we look at what he did at the end of verse 10?
Well, in context, he's also a zealot. So
That's true.
he does not truly care about who Jesus claims he is or anything else. He's only there because he wants that person to be the king to throw out the Romans. That's all he cares about. He is a true zealot.
That's true.
Put that in context for why he did. I mean, we look at it as a traitor to Christ, but there's a whole story that goes behind it.
Right.
Without him, we wouldn't have salvation. Because without him handing over Christ, Christ wasn't hung on the cross. Christ didn't die. So he ain't as bad as we think. We all give him a really bad rap. But without him, we won't have what we have.
That's true. He does play a critical role in the events that Mark is recording for us. Right. Exactly. What Joseph's example, what his brothers intended for evil got meant for good, is what Joseph says. But yes, Jeremiah is right. Is Judas is part of this group called the Zealot that were a very militant group, and there is some story behind this about Judas's mindset. His mindset was he was kind of hurrying the process along, that Jesus would become this king that many of the Jews believed he should be, that physical king, not the spiritual king that we know him to be. So those are also points we need to keep in mind about Judas. Any other questions or comments on Judas before we look at what he did? All right. So we're not done with verse 10. Move forward in the verse. What did he do? To do what? To betray Jesus. So that's the text. So it says he went, or the New American Standard says he went off. What does that mean? Oakley, I almost think your hand is up, but I know you're stretching. So what does that mean, he went off? He separated from the group. Now verses 3 through 9, where are they? What's that?
They're outside Jerusalem. He would have had to go into Jerusalem to see Caiaphas because it's Passover. So Caiaphas had to be at the Holy of Holies to offer their once-a-year sacrifice that is required for atonement for all people.
Right. So they are outside Jerusalem. We read that in verse 3. They're in Bethany having this meal. So Judas leaves the meal, this occasion, and yes, he does go into Jerusalem to the chief priest. Who are the chief priests?
Is it priest or priest?
The American Standard has it in the plural.
And the Greek is saying priest to mean Caiaphas himself. So that's why I'm really interested, because Caiaphas should not have been able to even have interaction with Judas. So that's why I find it, he even broke the rules.
Yeah. But who are the chief priests? Whether it's a chief priest singular or chief priest plural, what category are they in? The religious leaders. More specifically, religious leaders who are in a higher position of authority than others. So Judas goes off, and the text says to betray Jesus. So now we run into this word betray. What does it mean? The word betray. Okay, you might say to go against. Any other ideas? Right. That's true, and that's kind of where I was going with this. Is the word betray that we have here, it comes from a word that literally means to hand over. Now when you hand something over, what are you doing? giving it away. That's what Judas is doing with Jesus. Now, what did we learn from verses 1 and 2 of this chapter? What's going on? What are these chief priests looking to do? To seize Jesus and to kill him, ultimately. So now what is Judas doing? He's going to help them. They're figuring out, how are we going to do this? Judas comes along, and he's going to help it along. He's going to, let me give you Jesus. That's what it means to hand over. Give something to someone. In this case, Judas giving Jesus over to the religious authorities. Now, it doesn't happen in this moment, but he's already moving that plan forward. So he leaves the mill, and he goes off to the religious leaders for the specific purpose of handing Jesus over to them. Now, we know that's his intention because the verse literally says right there in the middle, in order to. That phrase means with the purpose of doing something. So this is Judas's mindset. He's already got the wheels turning, so to speak. So this is what Mark tells us. Right. Well, he wasn't mad, and Mark doesn't tell us. But this is where we could run into one of those holes. There's a detail that Mark leaves out. Something else we should know here, even though Mark doesn't mention it specifically, at this point where he leaves to go betray Jesus, he's demon-possessed. More specifically, Satan-possessed. Well, how do we know that? Read Luke 22, verse 3. We also find it in John chapter 13, where both those gospel writers, Luke and John, tell us that Judas was possessed by Satan at this point. Satan had entered his heart. So that's verse 10. Questions or comments on verse 10? All right. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from this verse about Judas's betrayal of Jesus is that Judas went off to betray Jesus. Mark has shown that Judas left with that specific intention of betraying. Again, one reason we know this is because of the phrase, in order to. That phrase indicates specific intention or purpose. So the phrase is applied to say that Judas went off to the religious authorities for the purpose of betraying or handing over Jesus. So that brings us into verse 11, the next point about the betrayal. Judas looked for a convenient time to betray Jesus. So breaking this verse down, Judas has arrived to the religious leaders. What does Mark tell us about how they feel? They were glad. What does that mean? Save them a lot of problems. But the text says they were glad. When you're glad about something, what does that mean? You're happy. Again, verses 1 and 2, they're trying to figure this situation out. How are we going to arrest? How are we going to kill Jesus? Judas comes along. They're happy because he has solved their problem. What do after Judas comes along? Promise to give him money. What does that mean? He's going to take it, but when you promise to give somebody money, what does that mean? You hired them. You are going to pay them. So with that in mind, here's some Bible trivia for you. Can anyone remind me how much they were going to pay him? 30 pieces of silver. We learned that from Matthew 26, verse 15. in Matthew's account. So that's Matthew fills in this hole for us. How much are they going to pay him? Matthew says 30 pieces of silver. Some say 30 silver coins. But we're not going to get into how much that was. Just the point is, they were going to pay him, and Matthew tells us 30 pieces of silver. It was a lot of money, and yeah, it was also the cost of a slave. Yeah, I failed to put that in my notes here, but that's also true. So that's the first part of verse 10. Any questions or comments before we get into the next part? Okay. So Judas comes to the religious leaders. He's going to get paid for what he's doing. What does Judas do next? Okay, we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But yeah, he begins looking how to betray him. He's already made the decision to betray him. Next step is, how is he going to do it? Well, what else does the text say besides how to betray him? The text says, and he began seeking how to betray him. What's next? Does yours read conveniently? Okay, that's good. That's good, because that's the idea behind what is said here. He's figuring out how to do this, how to do what he's already decided to do at a convenient time. The New American Standard has opportune time, but that's a better rendering of that is at a convenient time. Now, why is the time such a concern? Give you a hint, verses 1 and 2. What's going on? The feast. What were the religious leaders worried about? The riot. So this is why the betrayal of Jesus has to be so methodical. Because the main concern in this particular context is avoiding a riot. So Judas has to have this thought in mind too. So, one reason we know this is part of what's involved is because of what we read in Luke 22:6. Mark doesn't record it here, but over in Luke 22:6, we're told that Judas was looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus, as Mark says here. But Luke adds, apart from the crowd. The crowds are the main concern here. How can they take care of Jesus, negatively speaking, without causing this riot? His followers are a big part of this. That was actually said 2 weeks ago when we studied the opening verses, is that these people that are there at Passover, a lot of these are Jesus' followers, and they're going to be pretty upset if something happens to Jesus. The religious leaders know this. And so now it's on Judas to figure out how to get Jesus over to the religious leaders without upsetting the rest of his followers in the way that's described in verses 1 and 2. So that's verse 11. Any questions or comments on verse 11 that haven't been addressed? Did you have something, Jeremiah? Oh, okay. So, putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 11 about Judas's betrayal is that Judas looked for a convenient time to betray Jesus. He didn't only go off to betray Jesus, he also had to find a time to do it. Those were among the decisions that Judas was making. How to do it, at what time to do it. So it's this fact that should help us understand that Judas was thinking along the same lines as the religious leaders, because he too would be determining how he could best do the betrayal without causing a riot. Ultimately, the decision Judas would come to is to betray Jesus under the cover of night at the Garden of Gethsemane, away from public view of the crowds. That's Matthew 26. This is how he would avoid the riot. Do it under the cover of night. Over at the Garden of Gethsemane is where it would happen with the people who would come with Judas at that time. Again, that's Matthew 26. So when we consider these two verses that we've looked at tonight, the point we should be left with is that Judas decided to betray Jesus. He made a decision. He went off to betray Jesus. He looked for a convenient time to betray Jesus. Application to us, it's still possible to betray Jesus today. Judas wasn't one of Jesus' selected apostles. We are among Jesus' followers because of the decision we made to follow him. But even as a follower of Jesus, we can still betray him. It's a choice. Judas made a choice. It's a choice that's followed up by action. It's a choice that Judas put some thought into. Now, what this tells us then is that betraying Jesus is something that can be done consciously. But what we should understand from these things is that making the conscious decision to betray Jesus is something that is dependent on the condition of our hearts. Now, I mentioned tonight that part of what happened in the betrayal process is that Satan entered into Judas's heart. There was some possession there. Not a possession of the person, the physical person, but a possession of the person's heart. If our heart is with Jesus, we won't arrive at that decision to betray Jesus. But if our heart is not with Jesus, we will arrive at that decision to betray Jesus. So let me ask this question. How do we betray Jesus today? It's not a question we like to think about, but after what we've studied, we have to. Okay, what are some things that cause us to fall back? Our own desires. Anyone else? Okay, that falls into the things we desire. What are some things we wish for? Let's just follow that line of thought. Okay. Start putting things ahead of God. Our own selfish desires. So that's what it comes down to. But putting that in more specific terms, money was mentioned. We get that from the Judas story. Money is a very powerful force. Powerful enough that it can come between us and Jesus. So that's just one way we might betray Jesus, is by giving in to those desires that don't line up with what Jesus wants from us. Now again, this is all just some application, but at the end of the day, we betray Jesus by making other things more important than our relationship with him. Any other questions or comments? That's true. Exactly. Jesus already told his followers some of that back in chapter 13. Be on the alert. So, anything else? All right. Dean, will you close us tonight?